In 1535, King Henry VIII sat on a velvet-cushioned wooden box inside his private chambers. Beside his right hand hung a thick, stiff hemp rope. If you were to walk into that palace today and give that rope a firm downward tug thinking it would flush the toilet, you wouldn't get a rush of water. You would get two fully armored royal guards kicking the doors off their hinges, followed by the most powerful earl in England carrying a silver basin. For over 400 years, the bathroom pull string was a permanent fixture in European royal courts, merchant galleons, and Victorian townhouses. But depending on the exact decade you pulled it, that string triggered three completely insane outcomes: an absolute flex of aristocratic dominance, a trip to the local river, or, quite literally, a lethal explosion. To understand our first rope, we have to completely throw out our modern understanding of what going to the bathroom actually is. To us, it's a private, vulnerable, slightly embarrassing 5 minutes where we catch up on TikTok. To a Tudor king, a bowel movement was a high-stakes state event. In the 1500s, a monarch's physical health was the literal health of the nation. If the king was constipated, the kingdom was politically unstable. If the king had dysentery, the 16th century equivalent of the stock market panicked. Therefore, the king did not sit in the dark alone. The thick rope hanging beside the royal commode was attached to a complex system of copper wires and hidden brass pulleys that ran through the stone walls of the palace, terminating at a small bronze bell in the outer antechamber. When the king gave that rope a tug, it was the Renaissance version of hitting the call attendant button on a first-class flight. Except the person answering the bell wasn't a minimum wage worker. It was the groom of the stool. Now your modern brain hears the phrase, groom of the stool, and pictures some poor, mud-covered peasant being forced to do the worst chore in the kingdom at sword point. You couldn't be more wrong. Being the groom of the stool was the most coveted, cutthroat, highly sought-after political position in the entire British Empire. Why? Because of a fundamental law of human nature. Nobody is more honest with you than when your pants are around your ankles. The groom of the stool was the king's sole companion during his most unguarded moments. While the groom was inspecting the royal output to ensure the king's humors were balanced, the king was venting about which duke was getting on his nerves, which foreign war he wanted to fund, and whose head he wanted to put on a spike next week. If you wanted the king to pass a tax break for your cousin, you didn't waste time talking to the prime minister. You bribed the guy holding the linen. The groom slept in the king's bedchamber. He wore the king's cast-off clothes, which were worth more than a merchant's lifetime salary. He was in charge of the royal privy purse. In fact, this job was so insanely prestigious that the title was passed down exclusively through elite noble bloodlines. And here is the ultimate plot twist for American history buffs. Sir John Washington, a prominent 17th century English aristocrat, was deeply embedded in the royal court's inner circle of elite grooms. His direct descendant packed his bags, sailed across the Atlantic, and went on to become the very first president of the United States, George Washington. That's right. The foundational bloodline of American democracy spent a significant portion of the 1600s making sure the King of England had a spotless backside. When the bell rang from that bathroom rope, the groom didn't just hand over some rough parchment. He presented the monarch with fine hempen cloth, or ultra-expensive sheep's wool infused with rosewater. It was the ultimate manifestation of supreme aristocratic privilege. The king generated the mess. A literal lord of the realm cleaned it up. But this sanitized, rose-scented reality was strictly reserved for the top 0.001%. If you walked out of the royal bedchamber, traveled 20 miles down the road to a standard stone fortress, or boarded a transatlantic galleon in 1580, the rope hanging in the toilet was still there. Except this time, nobody was coming to help you when you pulled it. This time, the rope was the toilet paper, and it had already been used by 40 other people that morning. Step away from the rosewater and silk of the royal court and step onto the damp, splintered lower deck of a 16th century Spanish galleon, or look down into the freezing stone overhang of a medieval French fortress. In these places, the rope didn't go up to a bell. It went down, all the way down into the rushing moat, or the churning saltwater of the Atlantic Ocean. In Old French maritime slang, this was known as the torche-coule, literally the ass wiper. Here is the brutal everyday reality of the salty rope. When a standard sailor needed to do his business, he sat over a simple hole cut into the overhanging deck. Dangling through that hole was a thick piece of frayed hemp rope, tied securely to a wooden beam above, with its bottom half dragging in the ocean below. You would pull the wet rope up, grab the frayed end, do what needed to be done, and then simply let it drop. Gravity and the rushing ocean current would act as an automatic washing machine. Then, the next sailor in line would walk up, pull up the exact same wet rope, and repeat the process. If your modern brain is screaming right now, the physics of this are actually much worse than you think. Hemp is a highly absorbent, extremely coarse natural fiber. When soaked in freezing ocean salt water, it doesn't get soft, it gets stiff, heavily encrusted with microscopic salt crystals, and becomes an absolute condominium for maritime bacteria. Using the salty rope wasn't just a gamble with dysentery, it was an act of high-friction microabrasion. This created the most disgusting class divide in human history. While the crew below deck was getting saltwater rashes from a communal piece of rigging, the ship's captain, or the castle lord, was using something entirely different. According to the writings of 16th-century French physician François Rabelais, who dedicated an alarming amount of historical research to the topic of wiping, the absolute peak of luxury wasn't paper, it was the neck of a living goose. Rabelais famously recorded that holding a live goose by the wings and passing its warm, downy neck between your legs provided a sensation of miraculous voluptuousness. So, to recap the 1500s, you were either rich enough to use a waterfowl or poor enough to share a salty string with a man who had scurvy. By the time the 1800s arrived, the Industrial Revolution successfully killed the wet rope. It was replaced with a sleek brass chain, and that chain finally flushed water, but pulling it introduced a hazard that could literally end your life. Welcome to Victorian London, 1885. Indoor plumbing has officially arrived for the upper middle class. You walk into a water closet, look up, and see a heavy cast-iron cistern perched dangerously high on the wall, sometimes 10 feet off the ground, bolted near the ceiling. Hanging from a lever on that tank is a long metal chain with a ceramic pull handle. Why did Victorian engineers force people to reach for the ceiling to flush, instead of just putting the tank behind the bowl like we do today? It wasn't a stylistic choice. It was a desperate measure to keep Victorian homes from turning into explosive gas chambers. Early indoor toilets faced two massive engineering hurdles: municipal water pressure and the great stink of the London sewers. First, the pressure issue. Early city water grids had zero push. If you put the tank at seat level, the water would just lazily swirl into the bowl, failing to create the siphon vacuum needed to force waste through the newly invented S-trap pipes. To get enough kinetic force to clear the porcelain, engineers had to weaponize gravity. By suspending 3 gallons of water 10 feet in the air, pulling that chain dropped a literal water bomb down a wide pipe, violently clearing the trap. But the second reason the tank was put on the ceiling is pure survival: methane gas. In the late 19th century, city sewers were unventilated subterranean brick tubes packed with fermenting waste. This generated massive, pressurized pockets of volatile methane and hydrogen sulfide gas. Because early plumbing seals were deeply flawed, this highly flammable sewer gas would constantly creep up the household pipes and pool inside the bathroom. Now put yourself in the shoes of a Victorian gentleman in 1888. It's midnight. You need the water closet. There is no electricity, so you strike a match and carry an open candle flame into the room. If the water cistern was bolted directly to the back of the bowl at waist height, the creeping methane gas would collect inside the dry, hollow chambers of the unit. The moment you leaned over to lift the lid with that open flame in your hand, boom! Late Victorian newspapers contain scattered, horrifying reports of commode explosions, where individuals were blasted off the seat, suffering catastrophic burns to their lower half. By elevating the cistern 10 feet into the air and separating it entirely from the user, engineers created a physical firebreak. Even if gas leaked out of the bowl, it would disperse into the open air of the room rather than concentrating inside a pressurized chamber right next to a match. When you pulled that Victorian chain, you weren't just flushing, You were operating a piece of heavy industrial safety equipment. When you look back at the 500-year timeline of the bathroom string, it reveals a fascinating shift in human status. In the 1500s, pulling the string triggered social hierarchy, commanding a lesser noble to take away your mess. In the 1700s, pulling the string triggered nature, letting the ocean swallow it. In the 1800s, pulling the chain triggered physics, using the literal gravity of the earth to force it underground. Today, we press a silent silver button, completely detached from the mechanical reality of the sewer. We've sanitized the room so thoroughly that we've forgotten the sheer amount of aristocratic scheming, maritime infections, and Victorian shrapnel it took to give us a peaceful 5 minutes on our phones. So the next time you look up at a bathroom ceiling, be immensely grateful that there is nothing hanging from it. I want to turn the question over to you. If you were dropped into a historical time machine right now, which fate are you picking? Are you taking the captain's warm goose, the sailor's salty rope, or are you submitting your resume for George Washington's ancestral job as the groom of the stool? Drop your choice in the comments below. I'm genuinely fascinated to see what the consensus is. If you love untamed history, hit that subscribe button. Check out the deep dive floating on your screen right now, and I will see you in the archives.